This is the first time ever I'm going to use one slide. So, yeah, those who know me are clapping their hands. What I'm going to try to do is walk through a timeline of what has transpired here in Maryland from implementation of nutrient management practices, from the infusion of policy, the infusion of regulation, more implementation by the farm community, where we've gone over time, where we might be going in the future, how we're going to tell when we get there. And hopefully as we walk through here, kind of sprinkle over the conversation some thoughts about things we heard during the course of the day today, and drive home the point that as we've progressed, we've infused and included a lot of the knowledge that has been generated over the last couple of decades that you've heard about today. And it's been used to take advances. Some of those advances have been very subtle, and individual farmers have implemented practices which have done a tremendous amount of good that don't get scored on anyone's score sheet, but they're there and they're done. That's a wonderful thing. There's practices that have been put in place that have been very public and very headline worthy, and there's others that have not. But for the most part, each step has been based on how the science and the knowledge and the understanding has evolved as we've gone along. There's terms, there's processes, there's conditions that today we throw out casually like that. We knew that all along, understood that all the time. We didn't. We didn't have that understanding at one point in time, and now we do. That being said, before I start walking through this timeline, 10 years from now, we're going to look back at this session and say, we were idiots. We didn't know what the heck was going on. And 25 years from now, we're going to look back at this session and say, we're a bunch of Neanderthals, except for Andrew. The rest of us were idiots. And we hadn't progressed the science anywhere we should have been. We should have had all this knowledge in our pocket 20 years ago. But we didn't, and we don't, and we won't later on. So this is going to be a real casual walk through where we've been, and I'm not quite sure where we're going to go with the conversation, but we're going to start at the beginning because I was always told that's where you start. All right. In the 1980s, we started talking about nutrient management planning. It was voluntary. We sold it by saving people money on nitrogen fertilizer expenditure. All right? We started doing those radical things like manure testing, spreader calibration, those things that at that point in time were like, why would I waste my time and money doing that? It's just manure. It's just going on my crop. It's a pain to manage. I want to get it out of my pit or out of my house or out of wherever it is so I can get on with my rest of my business. Now those terms are part of what we do every day. It's part of the fundamental decisions we're making. And in that days, in the 80s, it was all basically nitrogen-based. We were trying to get nitrogen rates more in line with what crop needs to grow. It's pretty easy to make that balance when you're working on an annual cycle where you worry about nitrogen starting from ground zero pretty much every year, and you manage accordingly. So we managed our resources, we managed our BMPs, we managed our application rates along those lines. What happened while we were doing that? We have some fields where we were very productive in, let's say, for example, corn production. We're putting 100% of our nitrogen needs on that crop, and maybe a little bit more because we hadn't quite convinced people they need to go down to 1.0 pounds per bushel of expected yield. But we're getting closer. We weren't at 3. We had been 1.5. But what was going on with phosphorus at that time, right? So by following our knowledge that we had at the time, by implementing the recommendations we had at the time, by using the best management practices we were preaching and promoting at that time, sometimes we were putting on more phosphorus than that crop needed. We knew it. We didn't worry about it. It wasn't a concern. Not a problem. So the best science was being used. All right? Then come about mid-90s, 94 was the first record in Maryland where we started getting some research going on, some of these fields are getting really, really high in peak. Do we need to worry about this? This is a problem. The idea of dissolved P, soluble P, phosphorus moving down a hill slope when erosion wasn't happening was a brand new concept. It was just being accepted in the scientific community that does happen. There's a lot of debate among researchers about whether it was significant or insignificant quantity relative to what's happening in the whole pool of P that's moving around. That was new. We started to infuse that information. You heard that information this morning about the relationship between dissolved P and water coming off the slope versus soil test P. We take it as standard fact now. Mid-90s wasn't standard fact. We were just addressing it, just thinking of how we can use that, and trying to figure out how we're going to work that information into our new round of BMPs, our new round of management plans we're coming up with. Then on a slow news day in the summer in 1997, we had a fish kill down south of here a bit. Every news outlet in the 4 or 5 state region jumped on it. It became a sensation all of its own. The hysteria broke out. The first responses to why this thing can happen, why we can have this toxic dinoflagellate kill all these fish and cause potential human health issues, a big concern. You know, we needed to be interested in that. And one of the first proposals that came forward about why this could happen, well, maybe these things are excited and exaggerated and become more aggressive or more toxic with more nutrients in the system. Not a bad hypothesis. One that scientists should chase down an answer to find the answer to. So that became the story of the day. Within a year, we being the state of Maryland, okay, I'm a resident, I pay taxes most of the time, passed the Water Quality Improvement Act of 1998, which made all of our voluntary nutrient management planning efforts mandatory, essentially, around the state. So we quickly switched from a voluntary, educational, let's see where we can go to tighten things up a little bit program to one that's very mandatory, very regulatory. Regulations were written. A lot of people were involved in that process. It was designed by a committee, and we ended up with a product that we've been living with ever since. But that's when the whole mindset started to change. And see, that took from the 80s up to almost 2000, 1998. It took a long time in this scale. But things since then have progressed very, very rapidly. And things have progressed at a rate where it's hard to keep up from a science generation point of view. Science is generating new information, new knowledge. It's being implemented before the ink's dry. It's being implemented before we actually know all the permutations and twists and caveats and footnotes we want to add to it. But that's okay, because that information needs to be used. But I think everyone's got to realize that when information is being used that's fresh, hot out of the oven, there's going to be some places where it doesn't work real well, and there's going to be some tweaks that have to be made later on. So the door's going to be left open to make it adjustable as time goes by. So as part of this requirement of the Water Quality Improvement Act in 1998, that we had to have a P site index or a P risk assessment tool. We've been playing around with one for several years. It wasn't ready for prime time. So we hurried up and got it done and got it out there and solicited the help of every phosphorus researcher up and down the East Coast and across the US to get this thing done. It got done. It's out there, the tool, and as of today, it's still the tool, the law of the land. So that was a tool that was used in implementing the nutrient management regs that became the required practice for everyone essentially in the state who's farming. And the whole process of mandatory P-based nutrient management planning, the whole implementation process phased in over time, and by 2005 it was complete. So we thought it's time to sigh, take a breath. We'll ride this thing for a while. We'll tweak what the tools we have. We'll add new science as it comes in. We'll improve it. We'll get things where they can be implemented, in specific cases where the one model doesn't fit all specific cases. We'll work with this over time. Well, time wasn't permitted. Okay. 2009, Presidential Executive Order 13508 declared the Chesapeake Bay to be a national treasure. Sounds like a wonderful thing. I mean, I don't know who would ever disagree with that single statement up there. It is a treasure. We all love it and adore it. What that gave is that gave the authority that EPA needed, US EPA, to write a TMDL for phosphorus from Chesapeake Bay, which has been done. Okay, that was written in 2010. And that process was the result of taking the knowledge we have, using a lot of the modeling expertise that Pete Bottas talked about earlier about how do you forecast what's going to happen if you do practice X on this acre or practice Y on that acre, or what's going to do, and then using all the water column models, the estuary models to say what is going to be the quality of the water, what's going to be the dissolved oxygen, what's going to be the chlorophyll concentration in the water if this takes place on this many acres and that takes place on that many acres. And how's that going to work into reaching the goal? Well, we were forecasting, right? We're using all those tools, using all the information we talked about, all the soluble P stuff, all the hydrology stuff that Tony talked about, all the modeling expertise that Pete Bottas talked about, putting that all together and projecting using the big Chesapeake Bay Watershed Model Suite to come up with the answer, what's it going to look like down the road. And also part of that process was, and Lynn down front, I'm violating rule number 1. I put it on the slide. All right? Part of that process was improving the tools we're using to predict what's the loss potential for phosphorus for landscape. And the PMT, the phosphorus management tool, was in process of being developed. We were working on it. And again, time wasn't on our side. It needed to be included in the process of satisfying the requirements of the TMDL for the watershed implementation plans. Many of you in the room were involved in that process. The product was generated. The product is good. The product is sound. It was put out there like other things had been over the past year before the ink was dry. For some people, it was a shock. I point back to 10, 20 years earlier. Same thing happened then. It wasn't a shock. That's kind of how these things work. But the good thing is now we have time to tweak it, work with it, understand how it's going to work, hopefully roll it out in a usable and meaningful and helpful way. And then today we're here, right? At Phosphorus Symposium 15, we're here today. We're supposed to have everything in place so that phosphorus is no longer a concern in the Chesapeake Bay. The way I understand the nuances of the wording is you don't have to have the bay at that state, but you have to have everything in place so the bay will be at that state, right? By 2025. That's 10 years from today. Doug, Legacy P. We're talking about things that are going to respond over decadal time frames. We're talking about other things that respond over daily time frames. Some things that intertidal sediments may be 1,000 years before we see a movement there. We have to keep moving forward with the science, and we have to keep moving forward with using what we know, even if we're not 1,000% confident in how it's going to be implemented. Using the best knowledge we have to keep pushing the ball down the road, which is not the same as kicking the can down the road, Josh. But moving what we know forward and implementing what we can implement. But we have to make sure while we're doing that we're leaving the door open so we can go back and adjust. Because we're going to discover some things where it just isn't working out right. And we're going to have to go back and adjust it. So to draw lines in the sand that are not crossable, we can't do that. And we have to keep reminding folks that we can draw goal lines and we can try to implement new practices, but these immovable numbers and immovable lines that can't be crossed and can't be tread upon is a terrible way to proceed forward. We have to be able to assess, we have to be able to readjust, we have to be able to continue to move forward based on the science we have and not be stuck using something that's 20 years old simply because we haven't replicated 18 times on 27 paired watershed studies around the country. So we have to have that flexibility. So where are we going to end up? The TMDL achievement goal will be determined by model estimations of where we will be in 2025. They'll be determined by what we're capturing as potential implementation of management practices across the landscape. How many acres of cover crops are there in Virginia? How many cows are there in Pennsylvania? How many chickens are on Delmarva? How much chicken poop does the chicken generate on a Thursday? I don't know. We're going to be using all that data to fuel these models to predict. But those models are based on the science that scientists are generating. And as long as that generation continues and that information is included, and they're step-by-step improving how we predict, we're going to be in good shape. Right? I think the farmers in Maryland have adopted a lot of these practices along the way. They've done a lot of adoption that may or may not be, like I said earlier, checked off on the list of I've done this and I've done that. And I'll just wrap up with one anecdote, which I've told in different rooms at different times. There's a well-known farmer who doesn't live too far from here, okay? He came up to me at a meeting one time a few years ago, red in the face and ready to rip me a new one, all right? He said, blankety blank, Frank, I just got my blankety blank nutrient management plan from the blankety blank nutrient management planner, and it said I got to put 3.2 tons of litter on my corn. I am not going down to 3.2. I'll go to 3.5, but I'm not going to 3.2. And I said, great. We both know that we started working together 10 years ago. Your numbers were like 12 to 15 times. All right, so we're taking that step forward. The world's moving forward. Farmers are moving forward. Everyone's taking a step forward. And I think the story's getting better. We can't be caught up in the, is it 3.2 or 3.5? You know, that's minutia. Is it 14 or is it 3? That's a great step. So there's a lot of good things going on. And I think we've got to be careful in recognizing them as we go forward, that it is progress step by step by step by step, and the steps are small. But sometimes I'm really going off the field here. I'm wandering kind of like McGrath. The goals that are laid out there aren't the goals that we lay out for ourselves, but the goals are laid out there by political interests, by agendas, by other groups that require huge steps. And the way science works, steps come in small steps. As long as we can keep doing those small steps and incorporating that knowledge, we're going to be in good shape. All right? That's my soapbox. I'm done.